All right, Alexander, let's do an update on Turkey. And let's start. There's a lot to talk about. So let's start, first of all, with the economy. And the Turkish lira crashed last week. It had a bit of a rebound, but it crashed again. So it was a short lived recovery. I'm reading 12% last week that it crashed. It's at an all time low. Rate hikes, they have to come. I mean, I don't see how Erdogan can avoid this. And then let's maybe shift gears and talk geopolitics, Ukraine, Russia. There's a lot there that we need to talk about with regards to Turkey. But let's start with the big story, which is the Turkish economy, which continues to deteriorate.
Yes, I mean, the problem is that Turkey is a country which imports much of its goods. It's got lots of imported inflation. They've been hit, obviously, by the great worldwide inflation crisis. So, to some extent, it's an imported problem. But it's been massively aggravated by Erdogan's economic policies, and in particular, by his constant insistence that interest rates must be brought down. He has this view in which I should say he's not entirely unique, but in which amongst governments he is completely unique, that higher interest rates are the cause of inflation. And where most governments, where most central banks, where most people who follow these things say that if inflation is rising, that points to, too much money chasing too few goods. You have to therefore restrict the money supply in order to bring supply and demand into some kind of balance, and that means putting up interest rates. Erdogan's philosophy is that you do the opposite. You actually cut interest rates. His argument is that the higher the rate of interest is just another form of cost. So by increasing interest rates, you are simply pushing inflation up. So he's got this upside down view of economics, if you like. And what it actually does is that, of course, it means that with inflation in Turkey now running at 20%, an annualized rate of 20%, at least according to the official figures, is that the financial markets are looking at this situation and they're saying to themselves, this government, this central bank, this president are not going to do the necessary things to deal with this inflation problem. So they're taking their money out of Turkey because they certainly don't want to keep their money in Turkish lira, Turkish currency, because they're saying to themselves, if we keep it in lira, then the lira is going to lose all its value because inflation is going to take off. The lira therefore crashes, and because the Turkey has to buy goods, it has to buy energy, that's going to lead to higher inflation back within Turkey itself. And of course, the higher money supply in Turkey anyway is also going to lead to higher inflation. Now, I should say I take this business about consumer price inflation in Turkey being only 20% a year. I say only 20% a year. I think it's much higher than that. Wholesale price inflation is around 50% a year. So it seems to me that, there's been much talk about this policy ending in a hyperinflation crash. Well, Turkey's managed, because of help from its friends, to avoid that in the past, but it's causing growing annoyance to more and more people. And I wonder whether it can keep this up for much longer. It seems to me a hyperinflation crash is now once again becoming a real possibility.
What does that mean for Erdogan's position? Do you think he's in trouble going
Well,
forward?
electorally, he is in already quite a lot of trouble. I mean, the Turkish middle class is turning against him because, I mean, they're seeing their savings evaporate. The Turkish working class and farm people, people in the countryside who supported him for all sorts of reasons because prosperity rose. For most of the time that Erdogan has been president, Turkey's economy has been growing strongly, and many of them are religious, so they identify with his religious policies and they identify with his national patriotic nationalist policies too. But most of them are seeing their wages fall, their real wages fall. They're seeing their savings disappear, and they're becoming increasingly dissatisfied. And he's lost support already in the big cities, in places like Istanbul and Ankara. And one wonders whether, if inflation takes off and if we have a hyperinflation crisis, whether in fact he's going to retain any support at all. I could quite easily see it collapse. But the problem is that Erdogan has now positioned himself within Turkey in a way that the entire political system, in effect, revolves around him. He's inserted himself and members of his entourage, and let's be straightforward about it, members of his family into every conceivable Turkish institution. So one has to wonder whether, if there is a real prospect of him losing an election in Turkey in 2023, he will either go easily, or if he decides to stay and sort of face off an election, in other words, mount some kind of a coup, whether he'd be able to do it, because, as I said, his position in the institutions is now so strong. Always the problem with a president, with a government that wants to take that kind of step, however, in the middle of a hyperinflation crisis, is that how does it pay the soldiers? How does it pay the police, given that the currency it pays them in is deteriorating so fast? So I don't know. I think that Erdogan will not go easily, and he will not go quietly, even, as I said, as public opinion turns against him. But one has to wonder how much longer he can continue and survive in office if he is indeed going to lead Turkey into a hyperinflation crisis. Big question for me is why he's doing it. I mean, why is he sticking to this unconventional policy, which, as I said, is losing him support in Turkey and is undermining Turkey's economic position? Well, I think, as I said, he's got his economic theories, which are very strange, or some people would say they're very strange, but no doubt he believes in them. I think there are two other reasons. Firstly, I think that there's a religious dimension to this, which is that Islam basically prohibits interest. So I think he doesn't like interest rates because he's a devout Muslim. So that for that reason, he doesn't like interest rates. And the second is that I think that a lot of the Turkish economy, the people who support him, the oligarchs, if you like, in Turkey who support him, are based in the construction industry, and they constantly and relentlessly lobby for lower borrowing costs, because that's the way in which their money is made and their wealth grows. And of course, that includes, or so it is said, members of his family. But I mean, this is now becoming a policy that is endangering the survival of his own government and of his own position. But he doesn't seem willing to change it.
Have you heard anything about the Baltic regime change group that was formed? Have they said anything recently? And my second question is, have you heard anything? Have you heard the rumors? And these are rumors but I have heard a lot of it, including on some media outlets here in Greece, that he's ill, that Erdogan is
ill. Absolutely. There are lots of rumours about this, and the Turkish government is cracking down very hard on anybody who spreads them. And of course, I'm glad you've linked it up with this neocon grouping in Washington, because of course the Turkish authorities are in effect linking it to this particular grouping in Washington. They're sort of implying that this is an idea. These stories, these rumours, are being sent into Turkey from outside, and that this is all part of a further strategy to undermine his position. Now, I don't know whether or not there's any truth to these rumours, but of course, in the face of a declining economic situation, if the idea of Erdogan being ill, being unwell, takes hold, then it's very easy to see how the entire system could collapse, the political system could collapse, given that it is entirely built around him. Without him, as I said, it would collapse like a house of cards. So he needs to project the image that he is a strong, energetic, forceful leader in full control, in fully healthy, fully vigorous, in order to keep everything together. And if these rumours about his ill health are being spread on purpose, then, as I said, the people who are doing it understand a lot about what are the weak spots, if you like, in his system. I won't call it a regime, not quite yet, though it's starting to evolve into something similar.
Yeah. So you think maybe if these rumors are to be believed, that maybe the neocons, the Bolton group, that may be behind it. Maybe.
I wouldn't. I think that's entirely likely, actually. I mean, these rumours don't just appear. I mean, somebody circulates them, and whoever is doing it has a lot of resources. I mean, this isn't something that, people talk, get together in a cafe and say, well, I've heard that our president isn't feeling very well, and then it just spreads like that. Things don't spread like that. I mean, they're planted in social media. They're planted in all the kind of ways that these sort of things are planted, and that's how they spread. They don't arise out of nowhere.
Yeah. He may be able to. Who knows?
He may
His
very well
movements have
be.
slowed down. Anyway, who knows?
Well, absolutely. I mean, he must be. I mean, one thing I would say about him, he's a man of tremendous energy, but I mean, the amount he has to do to keep everything in balance must be exhausting. I mean, his foreign policy, which we're going to come to, is exhausting, and trying to keep everything in domestically, under control, must be exhausting him as well. It would not surprise me if he is actually slowing down and getting tired, and perhaps if that tips over into outright ill health.
Well, he's complicated his own life. It's his own doing. And that leads us into the foreign policy, because he's complicated it without having a reason to do so. But Syria, we actually should look at Ukraine. We should look at Russia, but let's start with Syria. So let's look at those three foreign policy complications. We'll call them that, complications, because it didn't have to be like this for Erdogan or for Turkey, but he made things very complicated on himself. Syria, he hasn't gotten out of Syria yet. He's still there.
No.
Ukraine, he's pissing off the Russians.
Yeah.
And I don't understand why. But Russia is, on certain days they're making deals with Erdogan, and on other days they're pissed off at him. So it's kind of a real weird relationship, an on again, off again relationship. Anyway, let's go Syria and move over to Ukraine and Russia.
Well, indeed, let's talk about Syria. But now Erdogan made a disastrous mistake. This is my own view. When back in 2012, he reversed his previous policy, which was good relations with Syria and good relations with the Syrian government, and backed massively the insurgency which was seeking to overthrow President Assad's government in Syria. Now that has ended in total disaster. It's triggered massive migrant flows into Turkey. There's millions of migrants in Turkey, many of them from Syria. One consequence is that the Turkish public, including a large majority of people who support Erdogan and his party in elections, are now saying that these people are unwelcome in Syria and want them to go. And this has been a new factor. It's only really started to surface recently, but of course the economic crisis is playing into all of that. So that is putting pressure on Erdogan to try to negotiate a way out of this crisis in Syria. Now, he made that mistake back in 2012, and then he made a further mistake in 2016. He was repeatedly advised by his military and intelligence officials up to the moment of the 2016 coup attempt against him not to send his troops into Syria. He was told this was a big mistake. It would lead to them getting bogged down there. It would create all kinds of problems for Turkey. Well, the coup happened in 2016. He prevailed over the coup. He replaced all the generals, and he did what he'd been agitating and wanting to do all along, which is he sent his troops into Syria. And the result is they've now got bogged down there. They're suffering casualties. It's causing any growing economic problems. And of course, he finds himself in a constant standoff with the Russians, especially in Idlib province, where he's been backing various militant insurgent groups who've been fighting the Assad government. And what's been happening is that inch by inch, that Idlib pocket has been made smaller by the Russians and by the Syrians. There's been sort of constant pushing and maneuvering there, but he's trying to cling on, even though, again, as I said, his military advisors are apparently telling him this isn't viable. Over the last few weeks, he apparently wanted to send even more troops into Syria, not to fight Assad and his government, but to take on the Kurds. And he was able to get a green light from the Russians and the Trump administration some years ago when he sent his military into the Syrian province of Afrin, which had previously been Kurdish controlled, but now he wanted to send more of his troops into Syria to fight more of the Kurds there, and he came up against an absolute categorical no, both from Washington and Moscow. And the result was, because the Russians and the Americans jointly controlled the airspace over Syria, he couldn't realistically do that, and he's had to pull back. But the Russians have been giving warnings to the Kurds that despite this no, he's still trying to find ways to do it. So he's bogged himself down in Syria, and what he's finding also is that not only has Assad survived and become stronger over the last few years with Russian help, but that the Arab states, who had been Erdogan's de facto allies in trying to overthrow Assad, are now increasingly siding with Assad. We've had the foreign minister of the UAE visiting Damascus and having meetings with Assad there. We've had other Arab countries, like Egypt, for example, edging towards patching up relations with Assad. And we've had the Saudis apparently starting to take the same moves and talk of Syria rejoining the Arab League, which will, of course, leave Turkey isolated on this issue, and with the Arabs perhaps starting to turn around and say Turkey's occupying Arab land and it should go. So Syria is turning into a debacle. He's losing support in Turkey over it. His own electorate is starting to become exasperated by it. The military in Turkey were never keen on the enterprise from the start, but he can't, again, find the courage to turn it round, to try to bring the thing to an end. Instead, he's clinging on.
Ukraine?
Right. Well, this is perhaps the most absurd thing of all, because of course this is where relations with Russia become incredibly complicated, because of course Erdogan has a very difficult relationship with the United States. Some of it, I think, he's got legitimate grounds to be angry with the Americans because they've taken a manipulative approach to Turkey over Syria and other issues, for example, and they simply ignore Turkish concerns over the Kurds. But anyway, he tried to balance the US by getting very close to Russia. So he bought the S-400 missile system from Russia. He built the Turk Stream pipeline with Russia. He's got lots of Russian tourists going to Turkey who are even more important to the economy now than they were before, given what a bad state the economy is in. He's also got deals with the Russians to build nuclear power stations, and he's negotiating with the Russians. This was denied, but it's now turned out that it's true, to buy yet more S-400 missiles and to develop with the Russians jointly a fifth generation fighter jet in substitution for the F-35. So he's got this apparently very close relationship with Russia. But at the same time, he seems to have an inability to accept that this requires certain compromises. He also seems to feel the need always to assert himself against his own partners. So at the same time as he has this very close relationship with Russia, he's forged an extremely close relationship with Ukraine and actively backs Ukraine in its conflict in the Donbass and over Crimea against Russia. Now, so long as he confined himself to verbal statements, the Russians basically weren't too fussed. But now, of course, he's gone a step further than that. He's supplied Ukraine with drones, with strike drones, which Ukraine has allegedly used in the conflict zone. I say allegedly because some Ukrainian officials confirm it, other Ukrainian officials deny it. Anyway, that has made the Russians extremely angry. And it's known that the Russians have, in private, taken Erdogan to task over this, and they've told him that this must stop and that he's endangering his relationship with Russia, with Moscow, by persisting with it. So what does Erdogan do? Just the other day, he receives a well-known Turkish nationalist in his presidential palace in Ankara, and this nationalist brings with him a map, which he shows to Erdogan, and which Erdogan accepts with approval, and this shows a pan-Turkish federation, which includes most of Siberia, vast areas of Russia. Of course, it's been reported in the Russian media. Dmitry Peskov, Putin's spokesman, was actually asked questions about it, and he's a well-known Turkophile, and he tried to turn it into a joke. But of course, a lot of Russians are extremely angry. So he again acts in this utterly weird way of, on the one hand, wanting to be friends with the Russians, or seeming to want them, understanding that he's become in some ways dependent upon them, and at the same time, in a kind of juvenile way, he sort of annoys them as well. He infuriates them by supplying these drones to Ukraine, by backing Ukraine's bid to join NATO, by backing Ukraine over Crimea. The Russians complain, so what does he do? He starts, accepting gifts of maps which show most of Siberia as part of Turkey and taken away from Russia. So, I mean, it's almost childish behavior, but of course it's childishness which has consequences, because Putin himself has been unbelievably restrained in his dealings with Erdogan. He's looked at perhaps what Putin would argue is the long-term picture. But not all Russians feel like that at all. And there are many, many, many people in Russia, and we've discussed this in previous programs, who feel that Putin has overinvested in the relationship with Erdogan, and that this ultimately is not in Russia's long-term interests. So all that Erdogan is doing is he's playing into that the narrative of those Russians who think that way.
Yeah, well, no doubt that Erdogan has made things very difficult and complicated for himself with regards to foreign policy. But maybe Erdogan, to be honest, maybe Erdogan understands that Russia has also made it very difficult on itself and its foreign policy dealings vis-a-vis Turkey, Syria, Ukraine, because he understands that, number one, there is a group of people at the core of Putin's team, at the center of Putin's team in the Kremlin, like Peskov, like Shoigu, who are Turkophiles, very, very friendly and very much aligned with Turkey. So he understands that they're going to stick up for Turkey no matter what. He also understands that given the trade and the cooperation, especially in the construction sector, where Erdogan is deeply embedded, and he understands that there are a lot of very powerful, rich entities in Russia aligned with the construction cooperation between Russia and Turkey. Many of those dealings, I'm sure, have a lot of corruption interlaced into them. Erdogan understands that Russia can't go against those interests as well. And then you layer on the military industrial complex dealings and the corruption that's interlaced there between Russia and Turkey. And it emboldens Erdogan to say, you know what, I can play around with Russia as well, and I can kind of play them off Ukraine and play them off Syria and say tomorrow I'm going to leave Syria, but today I'm going to stay in Syria. And I can show a map where Turkey pretty much owns all of Russia. And you know what? They ain't going to do anything to me. And he has actually, and to finish off my point, Erdogan has proven that he can dick around with Russia because he shot down a plane, and the response from Russia was the cutting off of the tourist season, but that was it.
Well, I think that's probably right. And I think that's exactly the kind of calculation that he's making, that he can afford to tweak the bear's tail and that the bear will growl, but it won't
I would
hit.
say more than tweaking.
Well, I mean, well, more than tweaking. More stamping on the bear's tail. The risk he runs with this is that, as I said, there are, I mean, all of those people that you've talked about are there. I mean, you mentioned Shoigu and Peskov. I mean, Shoigu, of course, is partly from a nationality, the Tuva people, who have some kind of connection with Turkey, and Shoigu, like Peskov, speaks Turkish. And another major advocate of good relations between Russia and Turkey is Nursultan Nazarbayev, who is, of course, the former president of Kazakhstan. But, of course, he's very closely connected. Nazarbayev is still very closely connected, in fact, fully integrated in many ways into the Russian power structure. He is someone who the Russians listen to very closely. And he's been a major supporter of close relations between Russia and Turkey. So there's that political thing. There's the military-industrial complex, which always wants to sell arms and weapon systems. And there's also, I think, from Putin's point of view, the grandest strategic picture. There's this idea that perhaps if you play with Turkey, if you sell them a few weapons here, if you do a deal there, you complicate Turkey's relationship with the West. That weakens NATO's position in the Black Sea. Remember, that's very concerning for Russia at the moment. And you've got that strategic picture too. Trouble is, things are not ever quite as simple as that, because Moscow, as we both know, having both been there, of course you lived there for a time, it's a very big and very complicated place, and you will find lots of people who take different views. And yes, the construction industry was very heavily integrated with the Turkish, but that's become much less important than it used to be. And the kind of people who benefit from the Turkish trade have become reduced in importance and in influence, as the China trade has become much more important for many of those same people. The military-industrial complex sells arms to Turkey, but not in huge quantities. And, you know, they might be looking forward to bigger contracts in the future, but at the moment it's still on a relatively limited scale. Other sections of the military take an entirely different view about the relationship with Turkey. My own view is that for the moment, because Putin himself is so committed to this policy with Turkey, this is, I think, very, very much Putin's own initiative. Because Putin is committed to it, the Russians will go along with an awful lot, will accept an enormous amount from Erdogan. But, Putin might not be there forever. And there are other Russians, as I said, who take a different view. So I think this is, again, a risky policy that Erdogan is making. And apparently, on Syrian issues, the Russians are now becoming increasingly assertive. They're gradually pushing the Turks out of Idlib, and they've just categorically said no over the Kurdish issue, over an incursion into Syria to settle the Kurdish issue. And of course, Ukraine is another level beyond that also.
Let's see. All right, we'll leave it there. Let's see what happens with Syria. We've been talking about this for years and years, and Turkey still remains. So let's see what happens.
Just to finish on that, though, the point is that the moment Turkey went into Syria, that's arguably when things started to go wrong for Erdogan. I mean, especially after 2016, when he sent his army there. Whereas if you think about it, since 2016, Assad has got stronger. So it's not achieving whatever it was that Erdogan thought it would.
Well, I wonder what would happen if Ukraine, under the orders of the U.S., does decide to attack the Donbass, and they use Turkish drones to kill Russian citizens. I wonder what Putin's response is going to be there, because not only will it be a human tragedy, but it will be a PR nightmare for Putin if that does occur. I mean,
absolutely.
PR nightmare for him. So I hope that Peskov and the communications team understand the risk they are taking.
Absolutely. I mean, and I mean, we come back to this. There's been a lot of people. I mean, I should say a lot of people in the foreign ministry are not happy with this policy. They feel that Russia has overinvested in Erdogan. If there's a war in Ukraine, if there is a war in Ukraine, then I mean, all these calculations end at that point. There's no doubt at all. There would have to be a major showdown between Russia and Turkey over this issue. We've discussed this many times. I mean, it's difficult to see how that kind of war would end without a decisive Ukrainian defeat, a major Russian victory. It would change the political balance, but it would also wreck relations between Russia and Turkey conclusively if those Turkish drones were used against Russian troops. I mean,
what would be the PR? Yeah, but can you just real quick before we end the video, what would be the PR optics if that were to be the case and Turkish drones were used in the Donbass?
Well,
and everyone knowing in Russia that those drones were kind of, Putin let it slide. The drones being supplied to Ukraine. What would be the fallout to the Kremlin, to Putin, if that were to take place?
I think what would realistically happen in that situation is that the Russians would do what often happens. They wouldn't blame Putin. They wouldn't blame the Tsar. They'd blame his evil counselors. Realistically, Shoigu himself is very embedded in the system, and he's popular because he's seen as the leader of the military. And if there was a Russian military victory, he'd presumably become more popular. But people like, but Peskov, for example, would be in severe trouble. I mean, of that there is no doubt at all. And the criticism behind the scenes would escalate even further of Putin himself. Putin does get criticised. We know that arguments do happen within the Russian government and within the Russian Security Council. And we know that there are senior Russian officials like Nikolai Patrushev, who is the secretary of Russia's Security Council, very powerful man, who is known to be extremely skeptical of this entire pro-Turkish policy. And he's a notable hardliner on Ukrainian issues.
All right. We'll leave it there. TheDuran.locals.com, everybody. Take care.